one company is going to be the first to create this artificial general intelligence, and that company might become the most powerful company that ever existed, right? So that is purely speculative.
You can have a bubble, but also that bubble exists within a sea change.
Mm-hmm. It exists within a context.
It exists within the context of all the...
You just fell out of a coconut tree?
Well, Casey, the other big news this week is that the markets are going a little nuts and people are starting to worry about it. And what makes this a story that I want to talk about with you is that a lot of the sort of panic and worry right now is about this question of whether we are in an AI bubble that is bursting.
Yeah, this discourse has gotten really hot this week, and of course that is a question right in our wheelhouse, and so I'm excited to hear the news and what you think about it.
So just for some background, at the start of this week, markets in the U.S. and around the world were really volatile. The most valuable tech companies, what they call the Magnificent Seven.
Which, by the way, did we know that they were called that before this week? That was a new one for me.
That was a new one for me.
Yeah, okay.
But it's also like a great name for like some sort of a figure skating troupe or something. I don't know.
Without looking, how many of the Magnificent Seven can you name?
I think I could name all of them.
All right, let's do it.
Microsoft, Apple, Google. I think that's the MAG.
Mm-hmm.
It stands for, I don't know.
Oh, wait, is it an anagram as well?
I don't know.
Okay.
NVIDIA.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm done at 5.
Is Netflix in there?
It shouldn't be.
No?
Might be.
Okay.
What are the... Anyway, we're getting off track here. Okay. So at the start of this week, the Magnificent Seven, which is what they call the 7 most valuable U.S. tech companies, lost roughly $1 trillion in market value. In the U.S., the S&P 500 fell 3%. In Japan, the Nikkei had its biggest one-day point drop in history. So it's just a lot of volatility. People are getting worried about their stocks, and people are trying to figure out what the heck is happening. And some of it has nothing to do with tech, right? That like there's this sort of jobs report for July showing higher unemployment than a lot of economists expected. There's also some factors about the Fed and interest rates that people are saying have played into these market moves. But the thing that makes it a story for us is that a lot of the focus this week has been on AI and the role that it is playing in all of the market chaos.
Yes. Now, I mean, the one thing that I would say is that while it is true that stocks were down earlier this week, it did seem like they more or less immediately bounced back, at least part of the way. In fact, as we're recording this, I think Meta is actually up for the week. So what you said is true. There is a lot of volatility, and this has been, I think, like one of the biggest subjects of the week is just what is going on with AI. I did just also want to note that.
Yeah. And I want to sort of spend some time kind of deconstructing the argument about an AI bubble, because I think it's really interesting and important. And it is sort of the big question that is kind of hanging over the industry right now is like, is any of this sustainable? Is any of the hype that we're seeing around generative AI actually pushing the tech industry forward? Or is it just like, you know, the metaverse and crypto and all these things that sort of come and go? So let me just sort of lay out the sort of steelman arguments for the case that we are in an AI bubble, and I want to hear your responses to them.
All right.
So the first argument that you'll hear from people who think that we're in an AI bubble that is about to pop or that might pop soon is that the economics of all this are just unsustainable, and they're actually getting worse. So far, in the first 6 months of the year, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, and Meta have spent a combined $106 billion, and that's probably too low an estimate because that only includes their capital expenditures, things like building data centers, acquiring GPUs, things like that. That doesn't include like all the engineer salaries and stuff like that.
And the ad that Google ran during the Olympics.
Yeah. That was probably at least a couple billion of that figure right there. And that spending is not slowing down. In fact, it is expected to grow. We know that AI companies are going to spend a ton more money in the coming years, maybe as much as $1 trillion, according to some estimates, to build out these AI systems. That is just a lot of money. And it's not clear that they have a plan to recoup those costs, right? You can't sell enough $20 a month ChatGPT Pro subscriptions to recoup the costs of spending hundreds of billions of dollars training these models. And unlike some technology where you spend a bunch of money up front to build something and then you can kind of sell it over and over again with no marginal costs to your company, AI spending actually scales as the products get better. Like it costs more to train the better models as they get better and more powerful. The costs actually go up. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that that argument has some strengths to it. I would say a few things in response. One is that I think some companies will win and some companies will lose. It's almost certainly the case that some of this vast amount of money that is being spent now is being wasted. I think it's also very likely that one or more of these companies is going to figure it out and be able to make some of that money back. And in fact, the way that this capital is being deployed is out of a sense that essentially one company is going to be the first to create this artificial general intelligence, and that company might become the most powerful company that ever existed, right? So that is purely speculative, and maybe we never get there. But if it turns out to be true, and you were like Andy Jassy or Mark Zuckerberg, and you said, we're going to sit this one out, history is going to look at you as like one of the worst CEOs of all time, right? Like, what was the point of making all these monopoly profits if you weren't investing them into trying to build the next thing?
Right. And this is sort of what tech CEOs have been bringing up on earnings calls over the last few weeks. Google CEO Sundar Pichai said, quote, "The risk of underinvesting is dramatically higher than overinvesting. Basically, we'd rather spend too much to develop AI than not spend enough and get beaten by someone else." Mark Zuckerberg also made a version of this argument, too. So this is something that is very much out there, but the tech companies are saying basically, the real danger here is missing the boat, not spending a few billion more than you need to.
Yeah. Now, where the economics do seem to be unsustainable, Kevin, is for the smaller companies, right? The startups like the Inflections and the Adepts and the Character AIs, companies that had raised tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and were once valued at $1 billion or more. They're throwing in the towel saying, hey, we're going to figure out some weird way to sort of get reverse acquired back into these tech giants, because as they look at their own balance sheets, they figure we're not actually going to be able to hit AGI before we run out of money. So in that case, it does seem like there is a bit of a bubble bursting.
Yeah. Okay. The second argument that we are in an AI bubble is just that AI progress is slowing down. You'll hear people saying this, like we're just not seeing the kind of rapid capabilities gains that we saw a couple years ago. And so maybe we've already kind of gotten most of the juice out of these systems. We're close to tapping out the potential of this technology. What do you make of that?
Well, so, I mean, I am sympathetic to this argument in some ways, because that has also been my frustration, is that we have been promised these, perfect digital assistants and so many other things, and they are kind of stuck where they were in 2022, or at least it feels that way. I think if the, AI companies were here, they would point to a million things that they've improved since then, and I think there's a lot to that. But to me, like, the real test of this question is what happens when these next generation frontier models come out. Once we see what GPT-5 looks like, or Llama 4, do we actually see that step change in capability that reassures us that, like, oh no, we actually are on a glide path to creating a super intelligence, or no, that actually was just hype and we've run out of ideas? That is just truly a question mark. I don't know the answer to it, but again, it is in the nature of business people and of venture capitalists to try things. And when you think about, like, what could a transformative technology be, hard to think of one that would be much more transformative than that. So it doesn't really surprise me that people are continuing to invest in it despite that uncertainty.
Right. And this, I would say, would be like a very, I think it's contingent, this argument, on what happens in the next 6 or 12 months, right? If OpenAI comes out with GPT-5 and it's as much improved over GPT-4 as GPT-4 was over GPT-3, if we continue to see like large capabilities increases from these models, I think that will be a signal that we just needed to kind of wait and give it a minute. But yeah, I think if the next models that come out of these big AI companies are just sort of incrementally better than the ones that we already have, I think a lot of people are going to start to say, well, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars to train these things again? Okay, that's the second argument. AI progress has slowed. The last argument that I hear a lot from people who are sort of skeptical of all the hype around generative AI, who think that we are in a bubble, is just essentially that we haven't found the right uses for this product yet, that it doesn't have product market fit. Elliott Management, which is one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, sent a letter to investors recently that basically made this point. It says, there are few real uses, that's for generative AI, other than summarizing notes of meetings, generating reports, and helping helping with computer coding. People will also say, look at how many people are just using these tools to sort of cheat on their homework. There have been some people who have observed that the usage of ChatGPT tends to go down during school holidays, basically just saying like, this thing, it's maybe useful if you're a student, but it's not useful to sort of real professionals doing real jobs because, it makes too many errors, it's too unpredictable, and the tech just isn't very useful yet. What do you make of this?
This one I just think is silly. It's like when you're like, well, all it can really help with is computer coding. That's actually really important. And as it gets more, as it improves over time, the goal of these companies is that you create an AI system that improves the AI itself, right? They call this recursive self-improvement, or RSI. But once you're able to get into that zone where the software itself is improving the software, then you enter this sort of liftoff state where it really does seem like, we might achieve AGI. So when Elliot comes along and says, well, I don't know, it seems like all it's really good for is like creating virtual software engineers that do the job of a human being. It's like, well, that actually seems sort of important to me. I would also say, if you don't think it's useful, well, ask a high school student if they think it's useful. Ask a high school student if they would miss it if it went away, right? So I think we've already discovered a pretty significant, utility space for this stuff. I am a lunatic and probably pay for 6 or 7 different AI services right now. And there isn't one I would cancel,
Wow. You pay for 6 or 7 different AI services?
Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude. I pay for it in Notion. I pay for it in Readwise, which is like a read it later app. I pay for it in Lazy, which is another kind of reader app. And I pay for it in Raycast, which is a launcher app. Wow. And, are those services redundant and competing with each other? Yes. And am I doing this in part because I think it's part of my job to understand, the state of the art in software? Yes. But again, I like all those things. And I think the AI makes them better. And I think they make me better at my job.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I do wonder if there's sort of a mismatch between what people want from these tools and what the companies are marketing them for. Like there was this study that I wrote about that came out of something called the Data Provenance Initiative at MIT a few weeks ago. And they analyzed a bunch of different sort of transcripts of conversations that people had with chatbots that were part of this sort of data set. And they found that a significant number of conversations that people had were like sexual or romantic, right? It was like that was what people want out of these things. But that is not what the companies want them to be used for. They want these to be your office co-pilot, your productivity enhancer, your coding assistant. And so maybe there's just a sort of a mismatch there. But I do think we are starting to see some more questions about the utility of these things. And I would just point to the ad that Google ran during the Olympics for Gemini, where it's like not quite clear what they want this to be used for. Is it writing letters to your favorite athlete? Is it helping you with some problem at work? Like the sort of use case for generative AI, I don't think the companies have been articulating that very well.
I think that is true, and yet we cannot assess the quality of AI based on whether Google's marketing is good, Kevin. Yeah. Because if we've learned one thing about Google over the years, it is that their marketing is absolutely unhinged.
Right.
I mean, here's where I will agree with some folks who say that we're in a bubble. I think it is true that lots of people try ChatGPT once or twice and can't figure out what to do with it. I think it is true that it is unreliable in ways that make it quite bad for many different use cases. And so people who have tried it and either sort of couldn't make heads or tails of it or just felt like it sucked and they didn't want to use it anymore, I'm actually very sympathetic to it. But our job is to try to see in the future a little bit and imagine what things will be like, assuming it does get 5 or 10 or 50% better, because it is our experience that it almost always does get 5 or 10 or 50% better. And so I would just not draw too strong of a conclusion based on the state of the art in August 2024.
Yeah, and I'm not sure which side of the argument my next point is actually going to support here, but I would just point out that tech adoption is often very slow, right? Like one of my favorite stories about slow tech adoption is the microwave oven. So the first microwave oven was invented in the 1940s. Do you know who invented the first commercially available microwave oven?
Was it Frank Microwave?
No, it was Raytheon.
Oh, okay.
So
they actually dropped them over Berlin to try to win World War II.
Exactly. So So Raytheon sort of invents this this microwave oven. The first commercially available one goes on sale in 1947. In 1971, almost 25 years later, less than 1% of U.S. households had a microwave oven in their house. They didn't achieve sort of mass adoption in the U.S. until the 1990s. So technology, the point is that technology, even if it exists, even if it makes a sort of measurable difference in people's lives, people's habits are just very ingrained.
Yeah.
And often it just takes a long time for sort of people to cycle through one technology to get to the next thing. And so, ChatGPT was one of the fastest growing apps in history. It, got to 100 million users within 2 months, which is like insane by sort of historical standards for these kinds of things. But I think it could still take a lot longer for people to sort of adopt this in any sort of mass way than the AI companies think, because we know from history that it sometimes takes a long time.
And that reminds me, Kevin, I've been meaning to tell you, you really need to cancel your AOL dial-up subscription. You're not using that modem anymore, and it's time.
But I like the CDs they send me. So, Casey, after laying out the arguments for and against the existence of an AI bubble, like, where do you stand on this? Do you think we're in a bubble?
I think I'm sympathetic to the idea that we may be in some sort of AI startup bubble. Okay, I think that it's seeming less and less likely that a venture-backed company that wants to sort of rival a Google or a Microsoft in creating AGI is actually going to get there. And I think that's like kind of sad. My hope was that there was going to be a lot more opportunity there, and so far it doesn't seem like it's been manifesting. On the public side, I don't think we're in a bubble at all. Again, I assume that a lot of this money is going to be wasted, but I assume that corporations are wasting billions of dollars every single day. Like, that's not a surprise to me, right? Like, but if you ask me, do I think that they are going to get somewhere that like makes them a lot of money? Like, yes, I do. What do you think?
So I think the synthesis here, and where I'm sort of coming out on all this, is that you can have a bubble, but also that bubble exists within a sea change.
Mm-hmm. It exists within a context.
It exists within the context of all the...
You just fell out of a coconut tree?
So I would compare it to like the dot-com bubble of the late 90s, where you did have a bunch of silly, overvalued companies that were raising huge amounts of money and didn't really have a business that was making any of that money back. And a lot of those companies went broke or got sold for pieces or whatever. And that was a bubble. Like it did happen. But at the same time, the internet was not a bubble, right? The internet was a transformative technology. And so we did not see the internet go away when the dot-com crash happened. And I would compare our moment in AI to sort of the dot-com bubble in the sense that, yes, there will be a washout. I totally agree with you. Like some of these sort of mid-level AI startups will never make back the money that they raised and will probably end up, crashing out or being bailed out of some kind. But I also think that we can't ignore the sort of sea change happening underneath that. And so, yeah, it may take a while. Investors may lose some patience along the way. But I don't think you can sort of put this one back in the bottle.
And to be clear, you're not saying that we are on the verge of a dot-com style wipeout, right? Where like it hits the public markets and like really affects the economy.
No, because the most of the companies that are sort of washing out, these mid-level sort of AI startups, are private companies. They're not, being traded on the stock exchange. The companies that are public, the Metas and Amazons and Googles of the world, they have these massive piles of cash that they're sitting on, and they have these other businesses that are kind of subsidizing their investments in AI. So, will NVIDIA fall? Will it be able to sustain its current stock price? I have no idea. But I think the idea that these companies are all going to come crashing down because they spent too much developing large language models is a fantasy.
The last thing that I'll say is that I had this formative experience, which is I started covering tech in 2010, which was right when the mobile boom hit, right? Like everyone started to get a really high-powered smartphone, and we saw dozens and dozens of companies get born, right? And all throughout this time, people were saying, are we in a bubble? Are we in a bubble? And some startup would go under and people would say, aha, we're in a bubble. And as someone, and I can't remember who, but I recall someone making a joke during that time, and it was something to the effect of, reporters have successfully called 25 of the last 3 bubbles. Right. And the idea is people are always saying there's a giant bubble, right? And I think, honestly, it just shows you how people still are traumatized to this day by the dot-com bust. But I think it should also give us pause when we walk around saying we're in a bubble, because I think recent history has shown that the tech industry is here to stay and has generally, been pretty good about figuring out where to spend its capital.
Yeah. I do wonder, though, if the investing community has enough patience to wait this out.
Sure, but also it's what choice do they have other than to wait and see? It's not like there's some other hot technology on that they're passing, while they spend all their money on AI. It's what are they going to invest in? Podcasts?
Let's spend $100 billion developing a podcast. I think that could be good.
Can you imagine the studio we'd have?
Oh my God.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.